Last session of this year for our economics and finance series, which I think has been quite successful, and we're pleased with it. We are in the process of lining up our program for next year. So the table on the side, if you'd like to either be added to the email list, put your email on there and I'll notify you with what's going on. And if you have any suggestions for next year, we'd like to entertain subject matter, and speakers. So if you have any suggestions on either of those and you'd like to leave them, put them there. If you'd like to talk to me separately, that's fine. Today, we have a program that was snowed out in February, and we're pleased to have Professor Peter Hendrick with us. Many of you know him from his days when he was our selectman and chairman of the Board of Selectmen here in Lexington. And many of you also know his credentials in his profession as a lawyer and educator. He's on the faculty at the law school at Northeastern. His credentials are as long as my arm. And this is one more of the outstanding professionals that we have in this town and that we have in this subject matter. He will be covering economic inequality, and it's a subject that's very active on the political front and the economic front today. So without further ado, Peter Hendrick.
Thanks so much, George. It's a pleasure to be here finally. This wasn't a snowed out date. This was that I came down with the flu and was unable to do it back in February, but I'm delighted to be here to talk now. So I should start with a caveat. I am not an economist. I was not trained as an economist. I was trained first as a philosopher and subsequently as a lawyer. I've spent most of my professional life dealing with a range of legal and policy issues that relate to questions of economic inequality, and have spent a lot of time thinking about it, but not as an economist. And so I was fascinated when, 4 years ago, Thomas Piketty published his book, Capital in the 21st Century, which tries to provide a deep look at what makes economic inequality happen, looking at it over a long historical period across countries, across different political and social arrangements, and tries to cast some important light on how economic inequality works. I found it fascinating enough that I think it's useful to talk about it, but I'm going to be talking about it as a layperson who's coming at it, trying to understand what wisdom it provides, and with an eye ultimately toward its relevance for people who do public policy work. There are probably, I'm going to bring up a few of the equations and a lot of the data that he uses. I'm not going to hold myself out as being the expert on that. Many of you probably have at least as much expertise as I. What I think I can bring is an opportunity to really try and think through some of the challenges and some of the implications of what Piketty has done. So this is sort of a quick look at how I want to structure what I'm going to do. I want to start by talking a little relying largely on the massive data that Piketty and his colleagues gathered about some of the actual patterns of economic inequality. I'm going to refer a little bit to some more local data. A lot of this is stuff that I think you can't read the daily press without being very aware of some of these dynamics. I'm not going to try and go too deeply into the details of the measures of inequality, but I do want to give a quick survey of it. But then what I want to really try and explore, and this is what Piketty does in such a challenging way, is what are the dynamics behind the changes in patterns of inequality over time? What causes inequality to grow or at certain times to decline? And then that's going to leave us, I think, with some puzzles about both what those dynamics are, about why we should care about it, and about what we should do about it. And that's where I hope to end. So, Piketty's work is quite remarkable for a number of reasons. It is not your typical economics text. He reaches across literature and history and sociology and data gathering and theoretical economics and tries to pull them all together in his work. But one of the major things that he and a large team of colleagues have done is to put together a remarkable body of data. Data that has been able to get very detailed information, particularly about high wealth and high income individuals who are hard to get granular data about. He's found sources to get very good data about that portion of the population. And he's done it across much of the world, at least much of the developed world, and he's done it in many cases going back for centuries. And you know, if you're interested, it's all available in a publicly available website so that other economists and others who are interested can play with or work with that data. But it lets him look at patterns on a very large scale, and I think that's going to turn out to be what's of interest to us. It should be said, there are a lot of different ways that one can measure economic inequality. And his are just, he focuses on a few that he thinks bring out some important themes, but there are many alternative ways. I'm not going to talk about Gini coefficients, although he does to some extent. I'm only going to, you have to pick. Who do you compare to who in measuring inequality? And you also have to pick what is the relevant measure. How much should we focus on income? How much should we focus on wealth? What's the relationship between those? That turns out to be an important part of his analysis. But let's start by talking about what I think people tend to turn to most naturally, which is income inequality. And so this is one of Piketty's charts tracing, this one's focused on the United States. We'll look at one a little later that looks at a broader, at least a few other countries. And what it's looking at is, this is a chart for the top 10 of the population, showing how much of total income goes to the highest earning 10%. And it traces it, I don't know if people can see the detail here, but it runs from 1910 to 2010. And the underlying numbers are themselves pretty striking. The top 10% has always earned over 30%, or earned is probably the wrong phrase to use here, has always received at least 30% of total income of the entire population. And at times it's gotten up very close to 50%. So income is very unevenly distributed. Again, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but here's a chart that just displays it. To give a little bit more content to what that, well, I guess the second thing to say is it varies a lot over time. Over the course of this century, there has been this fairly steep pattern of rise, fall, and rise, what he sometimes refers to as a U-shaped curve. And the period from the late 19th century to the present, on many measures of inequality, shows this kind of U-shaped curve, where inequality rose very high around the turn from the 19th to 20th century, then during the course of the 20th century steeply declined, and then in the last 30 or 40 years has been growing sharply again. What does that actually look like? I'm sure many of you have seen the recent data that has been put out through new SEC reporting requirements about ratios of chief executive officer pay to the median pay of the employees in their companies. And it's a very wide range of what you see, but the median of large corporations that report to the SEC, the median corporation, the median wage of an employee is, well, the salary of the compensation of the CEO is 133 times the compensation of the average employee in that company. So that one also, every indication is it has grown quite radically over the last 30 or so years. Just some statistics from Boston to localize this a little bit. And these are statistics that compare the 95th percentile to the 20th percentile. So it's a somewhat different measure, but comparing people in the lower income range to people in the upper income range. In Boston, that statistic is $17,700 at the 20th percentile. It's household income for a year. Try and imagine what that is like. For the 95th percentile, $261,000. So a ratio of almost 15 to 1. Looking not at the very top and the very bottom, but at the 95th and 20th percentile. So pretty stark inequalities. Here's what it looks like comparing several different countries. And again, I don't know if you can see this, but it's the United States, Germany, Sweden, Britain, and France, which are among the countries that Piketty has good long-term data, and going from 1900 to 2010. Interesting, if you can see this closely, if you go back to 1910, the bottom, that dark box, that's the US. And the European countries are all sort of clustered together up somewhat higher. This is, again, the share of total income that is earned by the top 10% of earners. They all go through that same U-shaped curve, but when you come out at the far end, it's the United States which is far and away at the top, and the European countries are all somewhat lower down, and in the case of Sweden, quite a bit lower down. So same general pattern, but with some significant differences from country to country. There are pretty big variations in the United States as well. This is a chart not from Piketty, but from the Policy Institute, which looks state by state, comparing the income of the top 1% with the average income of the other 99%. And there's a good bit of variation. The light pink states, it's somewhere around 15 to 1 ratios, whereas in the dark, whatever that dark color is, dark purple color, it's closer to 25, 30, 35, even 45 to 1. Massachusetts, by the way, is, on this measure, the 8th most unequal state in the country in income distribution. What accounts for those inequalities? And this brings us to the next complexity. This one is looking not at the top 10%, but at the top percentile, the top 1%, and is looking at what the components of that group's income is and has been over the period from 1910 to the present. And a couple of things are noteworthy. If you go back, I'm sorry, it shows what share of various types of income that top 1% gets. So the bottom curve, the squares at the bottom, that shows the percentage of all wage income that is earned by people in the top 1%. And it's grown. It's grown from about 8% to about 11% over time. So wage income has become more concentrated at the top, at least to some extent. And that's been a sort of steady, well, it's a very shallow U-curve, but tilting upward in recent years. The upper lines are the shares of total income and of total income excluding capital gains. And so what you start seeing there is it's not wages that are the primary source of the inequalities. It's non-wage income. Non-wage income is the big contributor to the inequality. The top 1% is earning a very, very large share of the non-wage income, and that's what's bringing it up so far up to the top. So where we need to turn next, I think, is to the source of that inequality, inequality in non-wage income, in the investment income. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from inequality in not income, but in wealth. And here, the disparities, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, the disparities in wealth are much more profound than the disparities in income. If we look at the top, here again, we're looking at the top 10% of earners, of households. And the top lines, those top two lines show the share of total wealth that is held by the top 10% of households. And I should also say, this is going over a much longer historical period. There's 1810 to 2010. So that U-curve is just what you see in the right-hand portion of the curve. And it's a shallower U-curve, but it's always been at least 60% of income has gone to the top 10%. And if you look, the bottom two lines are the top 1%, and their shares have ranged from 25% up to close to 50% of total wealth. So wealth is extremely concentrated. A couple of other things to note here. The dark line, the lines with the dark box or triangle, are Europe. The lines with the open boxes and triangles are the US. And here too, we see the same pattern we saw in the previous chart comparing the United States and Europe. If you go back to the 19th century and the early 20th century, inequality in Europe was much higher than inequality in the United States, but they crossed over in the 1960s, and since then, inequality, as it has grown in the United States, has significantly surpassed inequality in Europe. Again, just to give you just one recent piece of data that has been frequently commented on locally in Boston, comparing not by income groups, but by race, which of course bears very close relationships to economic inequalities in America. The median white household in Boston has a net worth of about $250,000. That's its house, cars, whatever assets, investments, retirement funds. $250,000 is the median. Probably a somewhat surprisingly low number to people in Lexington, but $250,000. The median household wealth for an African American family in Boston is $8. The reality is that the lower half of the population's wealth is essentially zero. They have no net assets, they often have net debts, and it's only in the upper half of households that you start seeing any kind of wealth accumulation, and it is very highly concentrated, as this indicates, in the top 10% and in fact in the top 1% of households. One of the consequences of that is that for the truly high income households, and we're coming back to incomes here, a very, very large share of their income comes from their assets, not from their wages. And so what this chart shows is as you go from the 90th percentile of households up to the top 1/100th% of households, the share of their income that comes from labor, that's the dark declining slope, declines very steeply. The share that comes from investments increases very rapidly, so that at the high end, it's up to 50 to 70% of income comes from investments. So it's investments that contribute to the truly high wealth and high income of the wealthiest, of the best off households. What is that wealth? So this is another one that Piketty has gathered extraordinarily interesting data on. He sort of looked at how capital, capital, you can look at capital from two sides. On one side, capital is our investments, the funds that households are able to set aside and use as savings, as sources of investment income. On the other side, of course, that money is going to pay for something, and the question is, what is it going to pay for? How has that changed over time? The dark declining piece at the bottom, that's agricultural land. And if you go back to the 18th century when this chart begins, that was a pretty substantial piece of all wealth. Not really anymore. The next one is housing. That the slice in here, which has actually continued to be a quite substantial portion of all wealth. And then the rest is essentially business investment. Investment in commercial real estate, in corporate investments, in any kind of business assets. And that has grown quite sharply as a share of total wealth. How is this measured? Notice what the vertical axis here is. This is asking how much do each of those amount to as a, and this is in the United States, as a proportion of annual national income. So if you look back to 1770 when this chart begins, about the total stock of capital in the United States was about 3 times the annual income in the economy. That grew to over 5 times by the time of the Great Depression. It then declined to somewhere around 4 times and is now growing back up to close to 5 times again. So we have the subcomponents of it, but we again see that same pattern of growth up to the early 20th century, then a U-shaped curve thereafter. And we're going to need to think about the connection between that curve and the other curves we've looked at before. So I think that's as much as I want to say about the patterns of inequality. And want to move on to the next question. What's driving this? What's really going on here? What are the mechanisms that are at work here? And the big question that Piketty is interested in, or at least that I'm interested in what Piketty is interested in. He's interested in a million things. But the piece that intrigues me particularly is this question. We see these patterns of growing inequality. What's behind them? And in particular, are they the result of some kind of underlying economic dynamic, underlying economic law, or are they the result of historical, social, political contingency? And the short answer, to get ahead of myself a little bit, is yes, it's both. And it's both in an interesting and complicated combination. And so I want to explore that a little bit. And let me start with the piece that makes this look like there is some natural economic dynamic that leads down the path to growing inequality. And this is where I'm going to have to be a little bit careful, because the way Piketty tries to explain this is with this set of 3 formulae. And I'm not going to try and walk you through these the way an economist might, but I do want to help you think a little bit about them, because they do tell us a lot about the dynamics that are at work here. So what are these formulae? First one, alpha is the ratio of income that comes from capital to total income. So you can calculate an alpha for a household, you can calculate an alpha for a national economy. It reflects how much of that entity's income is coming from investment returns on capital as opposed to how much is coming from returns on labor, on wages. And the reason this is tremendously important to thinking about inequality is because, as we've already seen, since wealth, the source of the investment income, is very unevenly distributed, the greater the portion of a national income that comes from capital, the greater inequality is going to be. So far, so good? Yep, all right. So how is alpha determined? Well, this one is really just straight arithmetic. Alpha is the product of 2 factors. The first is the rate of return on capital. That's R. And we'll come back and talk a little more about the rate of return on capital. It's sort of the villain in this whole story. So we'll come back to it a couple of times as we go along. And beta is the ratio that we saw in that chart, in this chart. Beta is these percentages along here. Beta is the ratio of capital, total amount of capital, to annual income, national income. And the formula, I'm not going to try and, this is where I'm going to leave it to the economists. If people want help figuring this out, we can talk about it later. But it turns out that the ratio of capital income to all income is simply a product of those 2 factors. So the higher the rate of return, or the higher the total ratio of all capital to the whole economy, the higher alpha will be, okay? And the higher alpha is, the greater inequality is going to be. So that brings us to the next question. What?
The GDP? I mean, is the total income the GDP? Gross domestic product?
I'm still
Total
not saying.
income is the GDP?
Income could be measured as GDP, yes. And there are wrinkles about cross-border stuff that he takes into account. That's another place I will leave it to the economists. So now we need to think a little bit about what we know about beta and about R, since those are the things that drive alpha, and that's the thing that drives inequality. Well, beta, and this brings us to the second formula, is determined over time, says Piketty. I think this is well-established economic wisdom, is determined over time by the ratio between two other things. S, the rate of savings, how much of annual income is put aside in investment into new capital, and G, the rate of growth of the overall economy. And the observation is, this isn't a strict arithmetic formula, this is a tendency. As long as S is larger than G, it's going to push, as long as the ratio of S to G is larger than the present level of overall investment, the present beta, it'll drive beta up, because it means that savings are growing faster than the overall expansion of the economy. That growth is producing a higher ratio of capital, because that savings is turning into capital, is driving a higher level of capital relative to the total economy. And that will approach an equilibrium when the ratio of S to G is the same as beta. If the ratio of S to G is higher than beta, it's going to drive the total level of capital up. If the ratio is below beta, it'll drive it down. So beta, it turns out, is influenced heavily by the rate of growth of the overall economy and by the rate of savings. I mean, again, that makes sense. Savings are what build up the total level of investment. How fast they're building it up relative to how fast the overall economy is growing is going to affect what beta is going to be. So now we have the question, what determines that? And we also have to come back to our question about what determines the rate of return, which is the other factor in our first formula. And that brings us to the last observation. And this one really is, this isn't a formula, this is just an empirical observation that Piketty's data overwhelmingly supports, which is that almost universally throughout history, the rate of return on capital has been substantially higher than the rate of economic growth. Turns out that the one exception in the periods that Piketty has data for was the first half of the 20th century, which is exactly when we saw the inversion in our U curves, the drop in inequality. If the rate of return is substantially greater than the rate of growth of the economy, what does that mean? Well, it means that at least those people, those households that have substantial capacity to invest are going to be making returns on their investments that are large enough to allow them to be taking over an increasingly large share of resources and to be increasing their levels of investment and driving up not only beta, but also driving up alpha, and so driving up inequality. So the secret to this whole story is that because R is persistently greater than G. Economic inequality is persistently growing. And as far as you can see from this characterization, growing without anything that will ever stop it. It will continue endlessly. And that certainly is one hypothesis about what the natural course of economic development is. We need to come back, and we will come back in a little while, and at this point, at least people who sort of were trained in traditional microeconomics are starting to say, well, that can't always be true. How can R always stay so high when it's not producing economic growth comparable to it? Now, the first thing to be noted is the data, and you know, the sources of the data going back over centuries and centuries may not be great, but Piketty has done a pretty careful job of trying to reconstruct, going back a couple of millennia, about rates of growth and rates of return on capital. And what he says, and who am I to question, is that the rates of growth, of economic growth, have, for most periods of human history, been substantially below 1% a year, typically way, way below that. And if you try just a little thought experiment, he does this little thought experiment, if you imagine it much higher than 1% a year over a millennium or two, you realize that it would produce geometric economic growth that is totally incomprehensible. So it can't be that over extended periods of time, the rate of growth is that high. But so he says typically under 1%. In brief periods, it's gone up to 2, maybe even in the early years of the 20th century, up to 3%, but rarely above that. Never above that, and rarely even close to that. The rate of return on capital, from all the evidence that he's been able to gather from a rich variety of sources, is remarkably constant. It has remained between 4 and 5% for at least 2 millennia, and doesn't change very much. Again, in the early years of the 20th century, it dropped somewhat below that. That's a before tax return, so if you have significant taxation of income from capital, that may change that number some, but pretty persistently in the 4 to 5% range. So the disproportion between R and G is persistent and quite stark, and it's a driver of continuing growth of inequality. So that's the, it's natural, it's inevitable side of the story. Is that the only story? Well, I'm going to switch to this. This is some local data. This is some Massachusetts data. And this is, let's start by looking at the period between 1973 and 2011, and at what kind of economic growth there has been. Bottom 20% of the economy of households, negative growth. Median household, minimal growth in real income over that period. Top 5% did a good bit better. So we're seeing that pattern of inequality that we thought was characteristic. Is that the only way it can be? Well, period between 1947 and 1973, it's a very different picture. Relatively even growth across all income levels. In fact, the top 5% did the least well of any of those groups. Now, you're probably also noticing a lot more economic growth, a lot more income growth in the earlier period than the later. That's because I've left out something here. So, in the recent years, there has been substantial income growth, but it's been tremendously concentrated. That's the first point. But the second point is that isn't the way it always is. Now, if you're looking over millennia, maybe say, well, 30-year period, that doesn't mean very much. Piketty's data says it's actually a substantially longer period. It's really the period from about 1914 to about 1973 that saw actually declining inequality. But the point is, this isn't a universal pattern. Here's one other way of looking at that same thing. This is Massachusetts data, but I think is consistent with Piketty's larger story. And look first at the blue line. That shows productivity growth for the period going back to 1948 up to 2014. Pretty steady. I mean, ups and downs, jigs and jags, but more or less consistent productivity growth. But then look at growth in hourly compensation. Well, until the early 1970s, it tracked almost exactly with productivity growth. And then, starting in 1970, it more or less flatlined. And you get this steep variation. Now, of course, that is exactly what explains the pattern there. That where were those gains going? They were going to the very high income individuals and households and leaving everyone else behind in a way that hadn't been happening in the earlier years. So there's at least some sense here that there is something other than simple economic laws at work. So two directions I now want to go. The first direction is to come back to Piketty's formulas and ask a question about that. But then the next question I want to ask is, for better or worse, a lot of us have been around for a good bit of the historical period captured in those two Massachusetts slides. Can we think about what may have made the difference? Why between between 1914 and 1970 something did the pattern of growing inequality reverse for 60 years? And what changed in the 1970s that led us back on, or led us to a path where inequality is increasing at a fairly steady and rapid rate? But first, come back to this question. If you think of this from the point of view of sort of typical microeconomic theory, when the supply of something grows, the price that it can command declines, right? We all know that. If there's more capital available, then the return on that capital, we would think, would decline. Now, of course, maybe not. Maybe as you get more capital, there are so many exciting and powerful and important new things you can do with the capital that you can find ways to generate new returns that'll keep the rate of return on the capital up. But there's not much evidence that that actually is happening. Productivity isn't growing faster. In fact, if anything, productivity was growing faster in the late 19th and early 20th century than it is now. So this is a puzzle, isn't it? And Piketty raises it as a puzzle. He actually is a little bit, I think he's a little restrained. He doesn't really try to fully explain what the story is. As much of an explanation as he has is, well, holders of capital aren't going to be happy with a return less than the returns they've historically had, and so they demand those returns. Now that, I'm sorry, does not fit with supply-demand market economic theory. The fact that I'd like to still be able to sell my whatever it is I'm producing for the price I used to get, even though there are lots more people producing it now, doesn't mean I can command the higher price. If there's too much supply, the price is going to drop. something other than the laws of microeconomics are driving the price that capital can extract. Capital comes with a great deal of power. That power includes the ability to control some of the levers that drive the returns on capital. Piketty doesn't start, but he tells the story of the French Ancien Regime when he had there's spectacularly good data from that period. And there's this fascinating phenomenon. At that point, most of wealth took the form of holdings of land for agricultural use, land that was in one form or another turned over to farmers who were able to use the land and pay a return to the nobility who owned the land. And the pattern there is the same, that the value of the land kept rising because the owners of land were making returns that were big enough that gave them more resource to invest in more land, so they were driving up the prices of the land. And the rents kept up, so that they kept, even though the price, the value of their investments kept rising, so did the rents they were able to extract, so that they kept making their 5% return. Again, how could that be? The tenant farmers weren't making any more. They were still farming it the same way they farmed it before. So how could they pay, why would they pay more rent? The answer is because that's the rent they were being charged. Markets weren't driving that. Monopoly power and control over the land was driving that. Piketty doesn't draw the connection, but I wonder if the answer isn't the same thing today in our rather more sophisticated and complex capitalist system. Does power reside with the holders of capital? Are they in a position to demand the return that they are accustomed to, regardless of whether the payers of that cost are in a position to pay it or not? So let me now come back. I'm sort of ready to wrap up and turn this over to some questions and some discussion and some conversation about where we go from here. But I think the first question that I want to ask of all of you is, so what broke up this pattern from the period from 1914 to 1970?
I think unions were an important part of it.
Okay, so unions were a big part, and again, both in the United States, even more so on the continent. So political power and economic power being taken by the non-capital holding portion and driving up wages and driving down return on capital. That's one thing. What else?
Computers and spreadsheets giving people power over their money.
All right, well, that probably not in 1914.
No, but the spread was started in 1973.
We'll come back to the period after 1970.
Oh, sorry.
Right now, what happened from 1914 to 1970?
2 wars and a depression.
2 wars and a depression. What difference does that make? Well, in Europe, the impact it had, and Piketty traces this. He's French. His focus is more on the continent than anywhere else. And the data is excellent there. The amount of capital that was just simply physically destroyed in those 2 wars on the continent is massive. So capital suffered huge losses just because of physical destruction, and the Great Depression destroyed a great deal of the value of capital throughout the world. So those are additional factors. What else?
I remember a union man back in 1945 explained this to me. He says the big thing was technology, that the Europe didn't have the technology that Americans did, and the coal miners to produce a lot more coal than the miners in Wells.
Okay, although
And the war
the
also
suggestion was that it's evolving technology. And evolving technology is unquestionably part of the story, although remember, technological growth was very rapid in the late 19th century, but the curves were still pro-inequality. The growth, remember that chart of productivity and wages separating? So productivity increases due to technology can be a factor here, but they don't seem to be the determinative factor. They seem to be, at least to some extent, affected by other things. So, yeah, you know, there's at least one other thing that I think deserves.
Monopolies.
Well,
like, say, Google.
like, so again, in the 1914 to 1970 period, at least in the United States, the trend was anti-monopoly. You had regulation, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. There was some actual disruption of monopoly power during that period. So that's another factor.
The income tax, the estate tax increased
Taxation.
spending.
By the 1950s, taxes on top earners in the United States were
We had a
90%. We had a highly progressive tax system. And the flip side of that is we had a set of protections of low-wage, low-income people. We had minimum wage measures introduced in the wake of the Great Depression. We had the Social Security system introduced, systems that were redistributive and protective of the lower part of the... So, a huge set of social, political changes that took place in that period that changed the shape of the curves dramatically. So then, what happened in the 1970s? And I actually think some of it is really not until 1980 or thereabouts, but what changed
Ronald Reagan.
then? So, okay, Ronald Reagan is one. And
Rising conservatism.
what difference does Ronald Reagan make to any of this?
They're way on progressive tax.
Okay, tax system changes dramatically, and I'm gonna sneak ahead a couple of slides here. I'm not gonna kill my whole system. Go back.
Also, anti-union stuff starts as well.
Right. So remember the air traffic controllers. I'm sorry, we'll get there. This is a pattern of taxation from 1940 of high income earners, of the very highest income earners, and how it actually changed from 1945. Notice what happened in the early 1980s is that steep decline. That's a huge factor. Unions have lost what little power they had in dramatic ways. Other forms of deregulation. What else has happened?
Technology. Huge technology, capital inflows for technology.
Okay, so new kinds of capital flows, international capital flows. People often at this point say, oh, it's globalization. And of course that's partly right, but it's something about the particular modes of globalization. It's a mode of globalization that is very capital-centric, very oriented toward allowing capital flows much more easily than labor flows that drive down the power of workers and drive up the power of capital. So a whole bunch of huge changes in not the economy, but the political and social systems that are at work. Yeah.
I think a large number of women entered the job market, and that meant there was more workers than the labor wasn't that tight.
Yeah, that probably is another factor.
Got robotics in the factory.
Yeah, well, again, I'm going to be resistant to the notion that this is about technology, because I think the data suggests that rapid technological change can cut either way, and at different times in history has cut both ways. So I'm not sure how much that explains, although, again, I'm not the economist here. Yeah.
Deregulation of financial markets. In other words, it all comes down to wealthy people taking political power, using it for their own gain against everybody else.
Yeah, and I guess that...
Starting actually with in the 60s with the conservative intellectual movement.
Although it didn't have much impact until...
In 1980.
The late 70s and early 80s, which seems to... And at the same time that we saw Thatcherism in Britain, and so is that the explanation? I don't know. I mean, so we're back to our question of how much is this necessary, how much is this contingent. I think there's at least some reason to think that it is not entirely inevitable, but that there are strong forces that push it forward. So what I wanted to do now is to turn to these two last questions and kind of open it up for discussion a little bit. I don't have huge amounts of wisdom. I have a couple of charts I was going to share, and I will be going to actually, at some point, want to bring this back to very local things and measures that are happening here in Massachusetts, at least a couple of which I need your help on. I need signatures on 2 petitions, 2 questions to go on the ballot in November. One which will continue the increases in the Massachusetts minimum wage. We're not doing very well on increasing it nationally, but we have increased it in Massachusetts from $8.50 to $11. We're now trying to put a question on the ballot in November that would raise it to $15. And the other question is one that would provide a program paid family and medical leave for all workers. Again, those are my particular little pieces that I can work on this, but I do need to collect. We need to collect 10,000 signatures on each of them to get them on the ballot in November. So if you're interested, there are forms in the back to sign. We can talk about that more. But let me back up to, does this matter? Does growing economic inequality matter? And you know, Piketty at one point quotes the Declaration of Rights of Man from the French Revolution as his standard, but it's not a simple standard. The language that he quotes from Article 1 of the Declaration is, men are born, I'm sorry that this is a little bit gendered, but men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. But then it goes on to say, social distinctions can be based only on common utility. So his notion is inequality is okay insofar as it is actually providing social benefit to the entire community. I'm reminded of, getting very local again, of famous Lexingtonian's view of this same matter, John Rawls, who said inequality is justified when and only when it benefits those who are least well off. I think it's the same basic concept, that maybe we shouldn't be too troubled by growth of capital and by the resulting economic inequality, if that's the way we get progress and improvement in life for everyone. So I guess the question that we need to put to ourselves is economic inequality, is the growth of beta in Piketty's terms, a cause for concern or a cause for hope? And I'm going to throw that one open, because I think I have a view, but I'm not sure it's not transparently obvious.
It's difficult to maintain a democracy because gross inequality
Okay, so that's one big concern. What, thoughts about that? The suggestion was that one of the problems from growing inequality is that it makes it more difficult to have a truly democratic system. True?
Yeah.
Increasing crime, people at a lower level are don't want any, they want income, but they don't know where to get it from, so they get it from drugs, they commit crime, and they recruit more people in that particular field, and that continues to create safety problems for us. Our cars are stolen, and our homes are robbed, and therefore we can't afford this kind of inequality.
So the suggestion is that economic inequality is a hazard even to those of us who are on the upper end of the curve because of the bad behavior it encourages. I mean, this is the pitchforks in the French Revolution is another form that takes, and I guess I want to suggest, before even going there may be another place to go. Go back to those Boston statistics I gave at the beginning. 20% of households in Boston have incomes of less than $18,000.
You need re-education.
Well, before we even get to solutions, how many of you can imagine surviving as a household on $18,000 a year? To me, every time I see that statistic, it just takes my breath away. It's unimaginable what the lives of those families are like. Now, Narayan correctly points out that it leads to all sorts of social misconduct among those households. But boy, before I even get there, I want to say something is deeply wrong with the society where, while the top 5% are making over $250,000, there are all these houses. So that's at least two issues. One is the issue of political voice and who's running our democracy and can we really run a democracy. A second is focusing not on the people at the top and being jealous of them, but focusing on the people on the bottom and worrying about them. Yeah, what else?
Yeah, well, on a macro level, something like 65 to 70% of the U.S. economy is from consumer spending, and if consumers start getting squeezed more and more and more, then it's a drag on the economy.
Okay, so
then there's less to go
this comes back to the question: can we make the Rawls Declaration of Rights of Man kind of argument that concentration of wealth is actually an economic good for all? And your suggestion is there are at least some respects in which it is damaging to economic activity, and it's what is certainly true is that as wealth, as income becomes more and more concentrated, people at the top don't spend very much of it on current economic activity. They tend to put it aside in investment and savings so that there is less consumer spending. That may be a concern. Okay, so that's another cause for some concern.
Yeah, that was Henry Ford's idea of paying his workers good money so he could buy their cars that he made. Henry Ford said
that's exactly right.
Thank you. Yeah. Was it, they've done a study that's shown that most of the development countries have upward mobility of the lower class people much higher than this country, because when you're born in Boston, there's no chance for you to get a kind of education or social context that would allow you to move upward in any economic sort of way.
And so another dimension of the economic argument for diminishing inequality, and again, one of the complicated things, and Piketty's work tends to focus, because he's focusing on capital and on wealth, he focuses on the very upper tier of the economy, and he doesn't focus in his analysis very much on that bottom half of the economy, which has no capital whatsoever. A lot of the actual, at least to my mind, and I think a lot of what I'm hearing from others, a lot of the cause for concern isn't about the high incomes of people at the top. It's about what consequences are occurring. Where is that income coming from? Well, it's ultimately coming out of not providing sufficient economic opportunity for a large chunk of the economy at the bottom, and what are the impacts on them. Now again, there's some causal connections that can be contested there. Is it clear that if there were a way to redistribute wealth, that would actually improve the lives of the 50% at the bottom, or would it have such negative other economic consequences that it wouldn't? Those are hard things to answer. Yeah.
I'm going to go back to your basic question that you started all this discussion with, and that is what's happening in our society. That's what bothers me, and why I started to read. I read Pickett's book, and I started to go back. I was at college in philosophy, was your background. So I read The Republic again. And in The Republic, he talks about what happens in all the societies in a historical context, right? At the end of The Republic, he talks all about Lexington, the whole thing. There's 5 ways that people govern themselves. And the 4th one is sort of a democracy, which supposedly we're in now. And do you remember what the last one is? Anarchy. And then it starts over again with monarchy. So are we headed for that?
Yeah. Where we're headed.
Let's breeze on through that.
We're already there.
So, I always worry about these conversations being ideologically tilted. Maybe is the way I'm skewing this, but does anyone want to make the case that we shouldn't worry about economic inequality? Yeah.
No, I think part of the economic inequality is that the middle class has almost disappeared. The upper middle class has moved into the higher income branch levels. And so you have these at the bottom that are going to be stuck there, that are going to be compensated by the government for doing nothing, whereas these others are moving up and increasing that inequality.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot of evidence that is the trend. Let me mention one other question that's worth thinking about as we worry about this stuff. When we look at the very first few charts, and we're talking about where does the inequality come from, what's making the rich rich, we saw there were 2 things going on, at least in the United States, at least in the last 40 years. One thing that's going on is the growth in investment income. And that's the result of concentrating wealth. But it turns out there's another big thing that's going on in the United States. And one of the things Piketty has nice data about is this is relatively unique to the United States. Everywhere you see this pattern of increasing concentration of wealth, increasing ratio of wealth to the overall economy, increasing high income earnings from investment. What you also see in the United States that you don't see elsewhere is an increasing tier of people who are earning, really earning, holding jobs in which they earn enormous amounts of money. And that's everyone from Tom Brady to, what's his name, Facebook. Zuckerberg. Yeah, that whole generation of high-tech billionaires, people who earn, and in some sense have earned, it was by their labor, not by their capital, that they have acquired their enormous riches. And all those CEOs who are earning 130 or 150 times what their workers are earning, they're not doing it, well, a lot of what they're earning is in the form of capital. They're getting stock options and other things that make them capitalists, but they're acquiring it by, just like all of us did, going to work, sitting at a desk, talking to people, going to meetings, whatever else it is that the CEOs do. Is that a bad thing? Well, first of all, I have two questions there, and Piketty doesn't try and really answer either of these. First, why is it, and is it something peculiar to the United States, that we have this changing pattern where the people at the high end of the earned income scale are earning amounts so wildly disproportionate to others? That that wasn't true when I was growing up. Mickey Mantle wasn't making the kind of money that Tom Brady is making, and the CEO of General Motors wasn't making what CEOs of large high-tech corporations, large non-high-tech corporations are making now. Why has that changed? Does it have a connection to the overall growth in inequality? Does it have a connection to the increased power and the increased exertion of power by those who have wealth and high income? So that's the first question. Then the second question is that a different issue? Do we have the same concerns about that? Is that just markets at work in a way that may be functional? Is our problem maybe really about wealth inequality, not about income inequality, to the extent that it's not a result of wealth inequality? Those to me are complex and open questions.
I'd like to make just a few points. One is there's not a consensus among professional economists regarding the correctness of Piketty's analysis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right.
For example, there is a Wikipedia article online about the book, and it identifies the areas of criticism that are made. Criticism about methodology, criticism about data, which tells you something about where there is not consensus. Third point is that the think tank called the Cato Institute, which is often described as libertarian, neither conservative nor liberal, but libertarian, has recently come out with a report, the title of which is Reassessing the Facts About Inequality, Poverty, and Redistribution, in which they argue that if you correct some of the data mistakes that Piketty and others make, then the United States is much less unequal in the respects we've been talking about than the general picture would suggest, that it's not the most unequal among democracies in the world, that its trends in poverty are not much different from the rest of the world. And I make these points just to say that, just to make the point, general point, there's not a consensus on the correctness of the Piketty analysis.
No, I very much appreciate your saying that, and it is certainly true. At least my impression, and again, I'm not an economist, so I'm not the best person to judge this, but from following the literature and the debates after the publication of the book, I'm less skeptical about his data than about some of the analytics. The analytics are, and he acknowledges this himself, are contestable and complex. The data, there are complexities about them, but the suggestions that the complexities skew them in a particular direction strike me as not terribly credible, but again, I'm not the best judge of that. The second observation I would make is the Cato Institute is very much part of, if there is a political story to be told here that says a lot of what's happened in the last 40 years in the United States is the result of political exertions by moneyed interests, the Cato Institute is certainly one of the most obvious candidates for an agent of that story. Now, again, that's a little bit ad hominem, but it's also, I think, descriptively accurate. So,
the point they make about the income data, for example, is that the data used by Piketty and that's most commonly used on income excludes the effects of taxes and transfers. And it's usually pre-tax and pre-transfer income that they use to measure the inequality. But the effect of taxes is to reduce the upper income. After-tax income, the effect of subsidies and transfers is to increase the income of the lower quintiles so that what people actually can consume with what they get after taxes and transfers is not as unequal by any means as pre-tax.
But that has no effect whatsoever on the trend. So again, I'm not sure, I don't feel qualified to get too deeply into that debate. I do think it's helpful that you raised it.
It's the opposite, actually.
Yeah,
Wait a minute, excuse me. It's actually the opposite, because wealth is taxed at minuscule rates, capital gains and dividends. The poor actually pay a regressive tax. Sales taxes and the like are much more, take a much larger chunk of somebody who's making $17,000 than somebody who's making $500,000.
Not to mention Social Security.
So, not to mention Social Security. So in other words, to me, excuse the expression, I think that's garbage.
Well, if you refer more to income support programs that transfer income to the lower end of the distribution.
Well, then you look at things like transfer of income, like the mortgage deduction that we all get to take advantage of, or we did until we paid off our mortgages, that they don't, which actually is much bigger transfer of income to upper middle class people and rich people than poor people. But we don't really need to get into politics, but let this gentleman go ahead.
Yeah. So, yeah, sure. Like just two more, and then I want to turn us in one last direction.
The statement that the gentleman who cited the Cato Institute made is a qualitative statement. And none of us here who have spoken actually have the numbers about when all of those things are mixed in of what the after-tax, after-transfer income distribution is. And I frankly have never seen it. And I'm just an ordinary person who reads the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Well, as Warren Buffett once said, his secretary pays a much higher percentage in taxes than he does.
Mm-hmm. So, yes.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at CEO's income or whatever the total compensation, it's because the board of directors gave them that money. And the board of directors are made up of like people who want the same thing to happen in their company, that their board of directors will give them money. So they have caused this inflation of CEO
Well, and people who have an interest in having allies in their efforts to protect their own wealth and assets. One can easily tell a story of well-intended people choosing, in a world of growing inequality, to increase the inequality of those who are their peers or near peers. I think that's a fair point. So let me just turn one last direction, which is, to the extent that we think this is a problem, what can be done about it? Piketty has some suggestions, although he acknowledges that they are either pie in the sky or trivial. The pie in the sky one is that there should be a global tax on wealth. That if there were, say, a 1% tax on all assets every year, everywhere in the world, so you couldn't hide them somewhere, that would bend these curves in fairly substantial ways. Is there a way to actually get there? I'm not sure I know what it is. So how do you actually bend these curves? And so I would just suggest that there are at least two areas in which it's worth looking and thinking. One is the one that was mentioned earlier, which is taxes, and particularly taxes on high high income and high wealth, and particularly taxes on transfers of wealth between generations. The bad news, of course, is that if you think that's the tool you want to use, we are heading rapidly in the exact wrong direction. The tax package that was recently passed at the federal level did exactly the opposite of making taxes more progressive. At the state level around the country, most states have now abandoned their estate taxes. Federal estate tax has become very minimal, except on the very wealthiest, and the very wealthiest have a whole bunch of very good ways to avoid most of its impacts. So that's not a terribly promising path, although again, just a quick pitch. We are hopeful that this November you're going to have a chance to vote on the so-called fair share amendment, which would impose a tax on millionaires, on people who have income in excess of $1 million in Massachusetts, and direct that money to programs that help the more general public by funding transportation and education. We're not entirely sure that's going to be on the ballot. We're waiting to hear from the state Supreme Judicial Court whether they're going to allow it to be on the ballot or not. But that's one small way we can do something on the local level. The other one that's worth thinking about is protections of people at the bottom. And there are a whole bunch of things that can be done here, but the minimum wage is one that's really worth talking about. Minimum wage in real dollar terms, both federally and in Massachusetts, reached its peak in 1960 and has been declining in real dollar terms ever since then. If we took in Massachusetts, if you took the minimum wage that we had in 1979 and had simply increased it with productivity, the minimum wage would now be $18.19. If you increased it at the rate that CEO compensation had increased, the minimum wage would be $120 an hour. We're not looking for that. But we are looking to raise the state minimum wage to $15 in a series of steps over the next 4 years. That question can only go on the ballot if we collected 120,000 signatures for it back in the fall, but now under Massachusetts initiative procedures, we need to collect an additional 10,000 between now and the week after next. There's a petition back there that I would love to get your signature on to help make sure that will be on the ballot in November. And then a second question, and this one we're hoping the legislature is going to resolve, and we won't have to go to the ballot, but we still need the signatures in case they don't, is another important protection for working people, to provide all working people with an insurance program of paid family and medical leave. And it's a complex, detailed program. I'm not here to talk about that, but if you would be willing to help us make sure that's on the ballot, I'd be happy to tell the details on some other occasion. So, are there other things? I think at this point, maybe we're supposed to wrap up in a few minutes.
Question:
if you've already signed,
if you've already signed one of these ballot initiative things, can you sign this one? Are you saying this is a new thing to sign?
We need additional signatures. If you are 100% sure that you signed it in the fall, there's no reason for you to sign it again. If you're in any doubt, the town clerk will check. So we'd rather have duplicate signatures than none at all. So be happy to have your signatures. Yeah, right.
So other question we didn't discuss much about is how can we improve the education of the underserved?
That's a topic for another, can we have 6 hours for that? It's a topic near and dear to my heart, and just again here in Massachusetts, the key thing that's happening, probably some of you remember in 1993 we passed a Massive Education Reform Act, which introduced a much better way of funding public education, in which we provide what's called a foundation budget for every community, where we calculate what would it cost in that community, given its mix of kids, to provide its kids with a good education. We calculate that for each community. We then calculate what can each community afford to pay from its own resources. We then subtract the reasonable local contribution from the foundation budget, and the state kicks in the rest. And that has dramatically reduced inequality in education funding in Massachusetts. Together with accountability measures, it's dramatic. Like we're now the highest performing state in the country in education. But the foundation budget itself, that first piece of that calculation, is wildly misaligned with reality. It undercalculates several major things. And there have been, the legislature had a foundation budget review commission that 2 years ago recognized the scale of those gaps. It's on the order of $1 billion or so a year that we're underfunding, particularly low-income communities. There are measures moving through the legislature slowly. The Fair Share Amendment would help provide the resources to change that. That's one piece of the puzzle, but it's a very complicated puzzle. Yes?
Another thing you have to do is define what capital is. One of the two major things in capital are land. And after the Civil War, the promises for land distribution were not carried out properly. So that left a great under.
Oh yeah, and it turns out, we saw that chart that showed
and the other factor
residential real estate is a very substantial portion of
right,
capital.
and protecting land from erosion, all these things. The idea of protecting your assets is extremely important.
Yeah.
In this country, they tend to spend their assets instead of investing them. And if you don't conserve your land in a way that makes more money for you, you're going to waste it. And the same is true with children. Children are the biggest capital we have, and if you don't protect them in health and education, you're spending your assets and not investing them. It's a waste of that. And when you charge people money for getting an education, that's the equivalent to spending your assets. And the government should never allow kids to have to pay for money to get educated.
Well said. Yeah, take one more and then I will wrap up. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how much, whether you agree with Pickney or not, with the data and so forth, or not, how much of this information is getting to our political leaders? In other words, how much do the economists up there, I say up there, do those economists know about this? How much do the politicians take into account these data? I mean, do you know if the information is getting there?
Yeah, it's a great question. When the book came out, it got a huge amount of play, and I think in the academic community, in the think tank community, it has been taken sort of as part of shared common wisdom. I think what I'm sharing is sort of what in circles of people who think in policy / academic terms is taken as at least a common perspective, not universally shared, certainly subject to some dispute, but at least the argument and the data are taken seriously and widely. If you asked your average congresswoman what she knew about it, I'm not sure what the answer would be right now. I think that's a fair question. Certainly there are people in organizations that advocate and are well respected and widely heard on Capitol Hill who have this as part of their vocabulary. Certainly, I think the notion that there is a problem of inequality, that one seems to be pretty broadly shared throughout the political conversation. I think that's something that at least many voices in the Republican Party and many voices in the Democratic Party both assert over and over again and share, not everyone, but a broader spectrum of that than you might have thought before the 2016 election. So I think it's a great question, and it's one of the challenges. So I think we're going to stop. Please don't forget to sign the petition on your way out. I'm happy to linger and talk a little bit. You've been a great audience. Thank you.